Hello and welcome to Comprehensive ELD, Making the Most of Content Instruction. This webinar is presented by the California Reading and Literature Project, Fresno State Region. My name is Jean Kofelt-Berletic, and I am a CRLP teacher leader and fifth grade teacher. I've been teaching for 21 years and have been with CRLP for about 20 of those years. So I have a strong connection with CRLP and a strong commitment to how great they are. I have a passion for literacy, language, teaching, and learning. Today we're going to be thinking about Integrated and Designated ELD as explained in the ELA ELD Framework. And our objectives today will be to develop an understanding of what comprehensive ELD means, to consider the essential characteristics of instruction for English learners, and to examine the similarities and differences in pedagogy, objectives, scaffolding, and content focus between integrated and designated ELD. We're going to begin with a little background. This quote from the framework explains, all ELs must have access to the types of high-quality curriculum and instruction called for by the California Common Core State Standards for ELA literacy and other state-adopted, SBE-adopted content standards in all disciplines. This includes math, science, history, social science, and other subjects, as long as they concurrently progress through the continuum of English language development. With that in mind, the purpose of the ELD standards is to clarify what English language knowledge students need, the skills and abilities they need in order to engage with and achieve all of the new generation standards. So that encompasses ELA, math, social studies, science, etc. And a little background, the ELD standards were adopted in 2000, or the California ELD standards were adopted in 2012. This adoption followed the adoption and implementation of the Common Core Standards for Literacy, and they were actually built based upon those. So you'll see a lot of similar content and language, and actually this made possible the framework that includes both sets of standards. The purpose was it has dual aims of rigorous content and academic instruction in English for English learners, and they wanted it to be practical to implement. It is based on sound theory, current research, and promising instructional practices, and has both grade level and grade level spans included. And this is a big departure from what our ELD standards were in the past. They were very different from the ELA standards, even though they tried to connect some. These you'll see a lot of language that is identical, but you'll also see some of the scaffolds that are written in, as well as the stair steps or on-ramp to those standards that are provided by both oral and written language. So the California ELD standards are laid out in this fashion. Chapter 1, the first section focuses on the standards, proficiency level descriptors and standards. So Chapter 1 provides us purposes, descriptors, and the structure. And Chapter 2 describes what those proficiency levels are. So it digs into those and says, what does it look like to be a student in different grade levels at each of the levels? The standards follow that, and those are different from our previous standards, not grade level span standards, but actually independent grade level standards. And the following 3 chapters are the professional learning section. So Chapter 4 really provides a theoretical foundations and the research behind the standards and why they're written the way they are, as well as the pedagogy that it would involve in order to teach those standards. Chapter 5 is learning about how English works. So this actually goes right along with one portion of the standards, digging into the grammatical and language elements that connect with different grade level standards for students of different language proficiency levels. And Chapter 6, Foundational Literacy Skills. Now, the standards, like I said on the last slide, have been around since 2012, but they're still considered new by many. And a lot of our new curriculum is coming out, and that curriculum includes these standards. But I would encourage you to take a look at the standards, and especially the chapters that are outside of Chapter 3. While you may have the actual standards there, really looking at the proficiency level descriptors is helpful. And I'm a big advocate of understanding the theoretical foundations and research behind it. And of course, learning about how English works really helps us understand how the grammar and the language builds and why they have it divided up the way they do. So it'll help you really make connections to your content area standards, specifically in literacy. And Chapter 6 being foundational literacy skills. Now, if you're a K-2 teacher or K-3 teacher, you may already have developed a pretty good understanding of what foundational literacy skills are, and you may have resources to teach those. Grade levels beyond grade 3 do not typically, well, they do not have foundational literacy standards, so these stand outside. And in the ELD standards, there's a section for each grade level that connects you to what types of questions you might ask in order to assess what your foundational literacy needs are for your English learners based on their proficiency in English, based on their proficiency in their home language, and also how similar their first language is to English in regards to foundational skills. So is it an alphabetic system, etc. So there are some wonderful resources on there, particularly if you're beyond grade 2 and you have a newcomer or a student who has gaps in foundational literacy skills. So phonics and word recognition, etc. Moving on to the standards themselves. The standards themselves are broken into 3 sections, and the 3 sections are interacting in meaningful ways and understanding how English works. The intent of the standards is really to capture a multi-layered complex process that it takes in order for English language development to occur, and that these are helpful and useful for teachers no matter what level you teach, no matter what content area you teach. And they are to help students engage with content regardless of their language proficiency. So their focus is to, rather than to provide a list of standards that we need to check off and go through, it is so that we can amplify, that is magnify and make clear the areas of English language development that are crucial for academic learning. Now, how you see that in this graphic is that what students are doing with language. So the interacting with meaningful ways side are the modes, or the modes for interacting in meaningful ways. So how are they interacting? Collaboratively, interpretively, and productively. And you can think of these, think about these and how they fit into a lesson sequence. So the collaborative mode is where students are exchanging information, both orally and in written form, and it includes both social and academic language. It includes written English, including print and technology and multimedia. It has students support opinions and negotiate, and adapt language choices based on the purpose and the audience. The interpretive mode, it requires students or engages students in active listening, analyzing and interpreting literary, informational, and multimedia text. It has them evaluate and analyze the use of vocabulary and other language resources. So this is how students are using language. Are they using it collaboratively? Are they using it to interpret and share interpretations? Or are they using it productively? And the other side, understanding how English works, focuses on the what. So the how English works. I mean, just the processes, text, and how they work together. So how are cohesive texts structured? So being able to understand that as you're reading, and also reading or viewing, and also as you're producing one, how do you structure a text so that it is cohesive? And expanding and enriching ideas, going from bullet points to looking at the different ways we put words together. This includes verbs, verb phrases, nouns and noun phrases, modifiers, details, and how do you put those things together? That's the pink circle. So how do you combine and condense the ideas? So you have all of these ideas and you have all of these words. How do you combine them and condense them and structure them into a cohesive text? So rather than a series of 6 sections, we really have 6 pieces that are interacting constantly. So these different modes and the different elements of understanding how English works work together in order to make students able to communicate both orally and in writing. And in short, it enables English learners to use students intentionally to make meaning and to engage effectively in many different tasks. So it enables them to do it, and it's also, so it's the vehicle and the product. So they're using English purposefully, and that is reflected in all of these elements. The third element that's not represented here is the foundational skills. So in order for students to read, they need those foundational reading skills. And no matter what grade level they are or age, they need those as a component of their language development. And across the bottom, you'll see the scaffold. So the scaffolding grows from and changes from emerging to expanding to bridging. But they all have these same areas that they focus on. Another quote from the framework: the California ELD standards position English learners as capable of learning about how English works and of making intentional and deliberate choices about language, depending on their purpose, audience, or topic, philosophical thoughts from the reader. The areas of new emphasis in these standards, the new emphasis on language is not a product, but rather language is a resource for making meaning, and that English learners comprehend and produce language better as they develop language awareness. Meaningful interaction with others and with complex text is essential, and English learners learn language and content better through intellectually challenging tasks and texts. And if you've been teaching for a while, you'll know that in the past, our ELD programs haven't necessarily been designed with that from that emphasis. Many times the language was watered down or made, well, what they considered more accessible, but really a lot of the meat and the work that students need to do and the meaningful interaction were removed. And key to this is that learning should occur through that meaningful engagement. The content-rich texts. Another thing that we found with ELD in the past was the content itself was not, well, while the content itself is not the focus of ELD instruction, it was not to the rigor that was necessary for grade level. And the new framework and the new standards actually focus on having access to all of those for every student. And the shifts that we've seen really represent the important implications for instruction, the use of instructional materials, and also the ways in which teachers observe and assess their students. And You can see a lot more examples of these if you look into the framework and you look at some examples of classrooms in the vignettes and the snapshots. We'll be looking at a few of those today, but a deeper look into the snapshots and vignettes is a good place to see this. This big picture graphic summarizes everything that is in the framework. And what I'd like to point out is that at the center of it is the California ELD standards. So we have common core standards for ELA and literacy, including reading, writing, listening, and language, and the ELD standards as well. And it says that students will read and write, listen and speak in all disciplines. So in that, the ELD standards become a tool for teachers to help their students, to provide them those on-ramps to the Common Core standards and all of the elements, including content knowledge, language development, meaning making, effective expression, and foundational skills. And if you look at these essential components, or these key components, you'll see that these are very similar to the language that we looked at in the ELD standards. And you can see how the ELD standards were derived from these standards. Taking a little deeper look at this, because they were derived from the Common Core standards and the current research and theoretical frameworks, the ELD standards have these several components that represent the shifts from the previous notions of English language development and how to use English language development standards. And these concepts influence the implementation of the standards, including professional learning, pedagogy, assessment, and of course how the curriculum is designed, and really how the day is laid out. One concept is that language is used as a resource for meaning making, and it's a resource from which students can make specific choices, and they can depend on, the choices can be influenced by who the audience is, what the purpose is, what the topic is, or what the mode of communication is. And this notion really suggests that teachers should portray the language not as a set of rules that we can learn and memorize, but as a powerful resource, not just for understanding what we're viewing or reading, but also for making ourselves understood. So that language is a tool for us to make ourselves understood, or that we could entertain others, persuade others, interpret, and explain. And a related concept is that when English learners develop language awareness, that is conscious understandings about how language works, they can apply that to different situations, and they're more ready to produce language and comprehend in different settings. The ELD standards position them as capable of learning English and learning content concurrently. Through collaborative conversations about rich texts and concepts, through deep interactions with complex informational and literary texts, English learners extend their language and their content knowledge at the same time. Second section we'll move on to is comprehensive language development. So both the framework and the ELD standards propose comprehensive English language development is how we will get students to this level of fluency with these new language standards. And that is a departure from what we have had in the past in a few ways. I think that much of the thinking was the same behind it from some teachers, where they would scaffold students during the day, but there was a block of time, which was usually 30 minutes or sometimes 45 minutes, that was ELD time. Now, comprehensive language development takes a look at that in a very different way. The ELD standards are designed to be used in tandem with the California Common Core standards for ELA literacy and other content standards in order to provide a robust and comprehensive instructional program for English learners. A comprehensive program for English learners has multiple dimensions and components, but should be highly integrated. Collaboration amongst teachers is key. So at the heart of this graphic, you see the comprehensive English language development, and the corners show the different components that are included. So we have learning to use English, or learning about how English works. And we have learning content through English, and learning to use English in different ways, so our different modes. So the framework also, or the standards also explain how English, rather than as a second language, as an additional language, and look at the stages of English language development and the relationships between the languages, and how they the student's primary language or first language could be used as a to leverage the language that they know, and to learn English. So making comparisons and analogies. And this comprehensive approach includes integrated and designated ELD. Both integrated and designated ELD are to be provided to English learners every day. Integrated ELD is ELD in which all teachers with English learners in their classroom strategically use the ELD standards in tandem with their focus on the California ELA and literacy standards and other content standards. So whether it's literacy time or it's science time, teachers are thinking about the language demands and scaffolding, and having language expectations to do that. Designated ELD is a protected time where teachers use the California ELD standards as the focal standards in ways that build into and from the content instruction. And those are in order to develop critical language that English learners need in order to learn the content in English. And this is to be provided by skilled teachers and not instructional aides or somebody else, but actually the teacher. And ideally, we want students in groups where they are working with students at their same language level. That's not always possible, but like the previous slide said, working with other teachers who are, if you have to deploy students, is very important, and understanding what the language demands are of upcoming lessons. So that really prepares them for, when we say building into and from content instruction, we're preparing student for content instruction, whether it's ELA or science or math. And then on the other end, we're assessing what they need next. So it's always moving forward. And so like I said, ideally they're grouped by designated, for designated ELD by their language proficiency levels. But considering the population, that might be a little different. And it should support their English language knowledge and abilities in order to be successful in the language that's called for in literacy and other content areas. And designated ELD, there's a reciprocal relationship between the two, integrated and designated ELD, and a coordinated application of the standards ensures that the teachers have what they need, so that the students need, so that they can accomplish the vision and goals outlined in the framework. So a little deeper into the standards, there they are at the heart, and the goals for the ELD standards are that students can use English purposefully, describing, explaining, persuading, informing, justifying, negotiating, entertaining, retelling, etc. So those are their purposes. And then they move on to the how. How are you going to do that? And here you'll see the pieces that we saw in the graphic earlier in the slideshow. Through meaningful interaction, collaborating with others, interpreting meaning, producing meaningful messages, structuring cohesive text, expanding and enriching ideas, combining and condensing ideas. So the purposes, the processes, and the resources. So what am I doing? How am I doing it? And what do I need to use in order to make that happen? And these really go together and focus toward readiness for college and career and civic life. And these are to focus back out to that outside circle, capacities of literate individuals, 21st century skills, students who are broadly literate and ready for career, college, and civic life. So these connect back and have the same goals as our ELA literacy standards do. So in short, English learners use English intentionally to make meaning and engage effectively in different tasks. Using English purposefully is reflected in all three parts of the California ELD standards. So let's take a look at the parts. So Section 1, the goal of Section 1 is to articulate the vision of that California has for English learners, the critical principles, etc. And you can see these are elaborated on within each level, but it's broken down into parts there where you can find the interacting in meaningful ways for your grade level, learning about how English works, and using foundational skills like we spoke about before. And connected to that as well are the corresponding California Common Core standards for ELA and literacy. So in collaboration, what are students doing? How are they collaborating how are they using language in meaningful ways? Collaborative, interpretive, and productive. So beginning in kindergarten, you're looking at students working on things like taking turns in a conversation, asking and answering questions, listening attentively, contributing to discussions and conversations, collaborating on writing projects, and offering their opinions. And in the interpretive mode, students are asking and answering questions using sentence frames, describing ideas, text elements, phenomena, understanding different types of vocabulary, including shades of meaning, adding details and lots of details. And these are all both orally and in writing. And in the productive mode, they're writing literary and informational texts, offering opinions, and providing good reasons. In the academic and domain-specific vocabulary, they're using that, and it becomes increasingly more detailed. In Section 2, we have all the pieces broken down so you can look at the standards and understand the critical principles for each of those within each grade level span. So students are exchanging ideas, writing, sharing opinions, listening, presenting, writing, justifying, arguing, and selecting language resources that might look like this. In structuring cohesive text, they're both orally and in writing, understanding text structure as they're reading or being read to, and also creating that structure when they're creating their own writing, expanding and enriching ideas, both orally and in writing. They're using verbs, nouns, and modifiers from frequently used ones at the lower level to at the higher levels, a wide variety of those, as well as expanding sentences from simple expanded sentences to elaborate, looking at structures on the text level being more sophisticated. And finally, connecting and condensing ideas by combining using clauses and a variety of ways to condense the ideas, both orally and in writing. And this is where a lot of this area is where our old standards seem to focus. So they looked at the specific grammatical forms that students might need to learn rather than how they were going to be using the language. So oftentimes their ELD instruction was decontextualized. So the focus here is on in context of what you're learning in class any time of the day. The teacher can and should provide the language instruction to enable them to both understand what's coming in and make themselves understood. So they can demonstrate their content understanding at the same time they're exhibiting what their growth in their language. So the big question, what does this mean for instruction? Some of the essential features of designated ELD that have been laid out in the framework are that there is intellectual quality, academic English focus, extended language interaction, a focus on meaning, and a focus on forms, planned and sequenced events, scaffolding, which is what we're going to spend a little more time focusing on, clear language objectives, corrective feedback, and formative assessment practices. So intellectual quality really goes back to, we're not using a watered down text, we're using a grade level text. Or another text, maybe it's a little bit more accessible, it could be a lower grade level, but it has an intellectual quality that would work for any classroom. That the focus is on academic English rather than social English for the main part, and that they have a lot of opportunities to interact with language, both taking it in and talking, focusing on meaning so that they understand that when I'm reading or when I'm listening, the whole purpose for that is so that I understand. And when I'm writing or when I'm speaking, I'm trying to make myself understood. So that's what focus on meaning is. Focus on forms so that the form matches the task. If I'm talking about cause and effect, I'm using words that would indicate cause and effect. This also connects back to grammar, where we're using appropriate grammar, so subject-verb agreement, thinking about tenses, etc. And that they're planned and sequenced, that would mean that we might start with something more accessible and build up to something that's more rigorous or more demanding on the cognitive level or on the language level, that it provides scaffolding, and the clear lesson objectives enable the corrective feedback. So the students know where they're going, and the teacher can provide feedback on that, as well as opportunities for peer feedback, and hopefully also for the student to be involved in their own self-assessment. And then that includes the formative assessment practices. So students would get they would get feedback on the language aspect anytime they're having an ELD lesson, and that would be integrated or designated. So the teacher would have some feedback and know what the next step was so that the student could also respond to that. And the characteristics of integrated ELD, effective instructional experiences for English learners throughout the day and across the disciplines, should be interactive and engaging, meaningful, relevant, and intellectually rich and challenging. They should be appropriately scaffolded in order to provide strategic support that moves learners toward independence. They should develop both content knowledge and academic language or academic English concurrently. And there should be a value put on building primary language and culture and other forms of prior knowledge. So understanding what your students know and what their experiences have been both in school and outside of school, so that you can connect to those. So that really goes with all day long. This connects also for scaffolding, that we provide different types of scaffolding and different levels of scaffolding based on the student's level. So students at the emerging level would have substantial scaffolds, and as they progress, it would become more moderate or lighter. And so this involves modulation. So starting with a context that they might be more familiar with, and the language, because the language is so rigorous and difficult. So we might provide them some more familiar topics to apply the language with before we get to something that's new to them. And in the students at the early stages of the expanding level, they can work with cognitively demanding activities with moderate support, both linguistic and content, and they develop and it becomes lighter. And they move to light, and students at this level, they can engage with much less scaffolding, much less support, and they have increasing ease with understanding technical English, the same levels probably that non-English learners have. So as homework for you in a fun time when you don't have something else planned, I would suggest taking a deeper look at integrated and designated ELD in the grade level snapshots from the California ELA ELD Framework. And these questions we'll send to you after the webinar. But questions for you to consider. So if you're a third grade teacher, take a look at a third grade snapshot or vignette and think about, what do you notice about the instruction? And try to look at an integrated and a designated example so that you can see the difference in the language and content objectives and how they're related. And consider what evidence of scaffolding you see in those lessons. So since we're not sitting together today, I'll say there's some work for later on. So we're going to take a look at a few scaffolds, and these scaffolds are broken up into the modes of communication. And I would say that a lot of these might seem familiar, but to me it was helpful to think of them in light of the standards to say, how could I get my students to be more collaborative, or how could I support them as they're being collaborative? But some of these are entirely new, and they're very impactful. For the collaborative mode, my first example is partner and small group interaction. A couple of things to consider here before you get started is providing them with some variety in this, so that they're not always talking to the same kids, and that you don't have a very high level student talking with a student who's at the emerging level, because all the time they need to have somebody closer to their language level so that they can provide feedback to the other student. But we do need to have the language models, and always the first language model in the classroom is the teacher. And so modeling that language to them all the time. But when you're asking them to talk, provide them with language models that they can use, like sentence frames or sentence starters, and not just putting it up on the board, but actually really teaching it. Saying it, having them repeat it, and then filling it in and showing them how it works with some of the words that some of the content that they've been working with, and including academic vocabulary word walls, and leaving those up through all the time. So it's a scaffold that they have as long as they're working on a topic. And so I think those are things that most people are pretty comfortable doing, but it involves a lot of planning too, because it's difficult to come up with a sentence frame on the fly. So this would be one of the scaffolds that you would certainly want to plan ahead. For the interpretive mode, this involves getting students to understand what they're reading. So these are some examples of how we might build background and build vocabulary. So the example on the left is an example that I actually created with the class, and the example on the right was a 6th grade teacher that I know. And they both developed throughout units. So the Panda Bear one, the students were reading several pieces of text about pandas, and they were also watching some videos. And so we used this to lay out both their prior knowledge. So I just had the sketch of the panda, and I asked them what they knew. and they knew they had black and white fur, but they didn't really know that much else. I think one student said endangered, and maybe someone else said that they ate bamboo. So, but they didn't have a lot of the other information. So this was a piece that stayed up throughout the unit while we were learning about pandas, and we added their new ideas to it. So it gave us a way to keep track of all the information that we were learning, but it wasn't necessarily organized into a hierarchy or a structure. So that would come later when we're asking them to do something with the information that they have learned. The other one, the teacher just wrote down the four categories that the students were going to learn about: religion, hieroglyphics, papyrus, and mummies. And she said that the students have very little background, that actually the only thing that they said was, I think King Tut was a mummy, and that hieroglyphs were pictures. So they did know that about those. And so throughout the unit, they built this and connected it with images as well. And that supports that built some background and gave a place to host the vocabulary throughout the unit. And this is an example, and I don't know if the video is going to run, but this is an example of getting kids motivated to read or to watch a video or to learn about a topic. And in science, it's really easy to come up with these ideas. This is we call it a phenomena, and it could just be an image. So in this picture, we see a bean, and then we see it begin to grow, and then we see it actually becoming a plant. So I'll show you the video. It should pop right up. And there's no sound, but I just played this video for students, and they watched silently. And there were oohs and ahs. And so my question to them, or my prompt to them, was watch and see what you notice happening. And these were second graders. So I won't play the whole thing, but it goes up to 14 days. So the students had a lot of questions, and it really drew out some of the information that they already knew about how plants grow. And it set up a place for us to begin our study of growing plants. So this next one is a lot of times people's favorite one. And I will say I love this one, and I'll tell you how I used it. I'm not going to chant it for you, but chants or songs, they really help to build vocabulary and fluency. I'll show you, I'll demonstrate the beginning of it. This one is Panda in Plight, and we did it like a so I would say it and then they would say it. So it would be giant pandas are black and white, and then the students would say it. And we went through the whole thing. So we probably took 2 days of ELD time practicing this and saying this. And it really has a lot of the key vocabulary for the entire unit that we were going to be focusing on. And we would come back to it each day. So what actually surprised me, I wrote this thinking it would be a good way to get them engaged, but what I found was when the students were actually asked to write, they actually cited pieces of information from this text. So they keyed in on some of this text, and we spent a lot of time talking about the vocabulary in this context before we moved to a less accessible one, which was actually a book that they were reading. So, but the caveat here is there isn't one written for everything, and they take a little bit of time, but the kids really love them, and they're very powerful for teaching vocabulary and helping them develop fluency. This one is seemingly so simple, but so powerful, setting a purpose for reading or viewing. And it really improves their self-monitoring when they know I'm listening to find out where pandas live. They're not worried about all the extra information. And in that way, it helps them improve comprehension and provides them with that laser-like focus. So, and if you've done close readings or multiple readings of a text, you might have multiple purposes for reading. So this time we're going to read and listen for all the words, or look for all the words that are verbs. So you could have them hone in on any different thing, and it really gives them a different way to read the text and interact with the text. Also really helps with fluency. And of course, while you're reading or viewing, planning and asking those text-dependent questions really scaffolds them, and also giving them scaffolds while you're asking them. So your text-dependent questions can have a lot of different kinds of focus. They could focus on the general main ideas or the gist. They could focus on the structure of any piece of text. They could focus on language clarity and conventions, and including the vocabulary load. So sometimes the words are taking out some of the vocabulary words and really talking about them really lightens the vocabulary load when they reread it. And also the knowledge demands. These are things to keep in mind. What is their life experience with this, and asking and connecting to that? What are their content experiences and background? And then how does this relate to other cultural things that they're familiar with, or other pieces of literature they've read, as well as levels of meaning or different purposes. On the productive side, this is where we get into some scaffolds that will help students with the productive side, or actually taking all of that information. If you think of the panda, we had lots of information from its body to where it lived to that it was endangered and what it ate. This takes the study and formulates it into a different, reorganizes it. So this example is based on a unit where students were comparing mammals or bats to birds, or bats to owls. And what they're seeing is, what do we know about them? So they would most likely have already maybe a circle map or just a cluster map that shows what they know about the two different animals. And now we're taking those ideas out and we're reorganizing them, in this case into a Venn diagram, where we can think about how they're the same and how they're different. And in this way, we're teaching them using a content that they now know, connecting to that content that maybe they learned in ELA or in science. And now we're saying, okay, when we're talking about similarities and differences, this is how we do it. So an example at the emerging level, students might be asked the prompt, how are bats and owls the same? And how they might fill that in would be bats and owls can fly, bats and owls are nocturnal. Now the bolded words are most likely on that, that vocabulary chart that goes with the content that they're focused on. And the other ones are the ones that they have to use if they're going to make sense out and organize the ideas that they know. Oftentimes in the past, we accepted simple words, a one-word answer from students. So how are bats and owls the same? Fly. Well, they know more than fly. So we give them the scaffold of blank and blank are or can blank. And they could come up with something like bats and owls can fly, bats and owls are nocturnal. Same thing with differences. Students might want to say just mammals or birds. And here we give them some frames, and that enables them to organize their ideas. At the expanding level, we might ask, how are bats and owls similar or alike? So we're elevating the academic language. Or what do bats and owls have in common? And for differences, we might say, what are some differences between bats and owls? And the responses you can see on the right. Again, we have a lot of the same vocabulary that we had at the emerging level, but we're ramping up the academic frames to support them putting more ideas together. So both bats and owls are nocturnal, navigate at night, and are predators. So they're tying together 3 different ideas about what they have in common or what in ways in which they are similar. Or at the bottom, bats are mammals, have fur, and are born alive, but owls are birds, have feathers, and hatch from eggs. And as you can imagine, not every first grader, this is a first grade lesson, not every first grader talks like that. So this type of language support, even at the expanding level, is something very sophisticated that all students in the class tend to benefit from, not just English learners. More at the expanding level, we would maybe introduce a term like characteristics. So what characteristics do bats and owls share? And so then they could go back to that Venn diagram and they would look for, okay, what are characteristics? And they could maybe, the teacher might highlight those. Those would be the words we would use to complete this one, like being nocturnal or being mammals. And then what are some important differences? Now this one's a little bit more sophisticated in that we're asking them not just to list one, but to select one that they feel is important. And that's a whole different level. So with the expanding and bridging levels, we might actually get it to some comparative writing. And this would definitely be our goal. And in this case, the first graders were writing multiple sentences comparing the 2 animals. So how are they similar and how are they different? Bats and owls are both nocturnal animals that fly. They are different because bats are mammals and owls are birds. Now in these examples, you'll see many different sentence frames. When the teacher taught this, we had listed some sentence frames that supported similarities and sentence frames for differences. And the students made the decision about how they wanted to actually organize that internally in their writing. So the teacher didn't list it like a paragraph where they just fill in the blanks. But you can see the rigor of these sentence frames is very high. The most notable is that, so they're listing several differences, several major differences, and it's getting quite sophisticated. Another way you could think of this is a summary organizer. And this one is a pretty simple example of how a student might plan to talk about a process or a sequence of events, maybe before they write on it. So this is a flow map of how to make a peanut butter sandwich. And the students could take their knowledge of the experience and put it into the boxes, use this to practice talking, and then use this to write a paragraph about how would you make a peanut butter sandwich. Another example, describing things or comparing and contrasting. We could think about different animals' habitats, and this would be a second grade one with desert, tundra, and tropical rainforests. So how are these different areas? You could describe them, first of all, a prerequisite skill. A desert has little water, it is hot during the day or cold at night, and sparse plant life, etc. Or they could choose to compare and contrast, or they could compare and contrast all 3. But it takes what they've learned about the different habitats and reorganizes it in a way that they can then describe and or compare and contrast. Another summary graphic organizer that is helpful, especially writing sequence of events for longer pieces, would be a timeline. What's interesting about a timeline, I use this one with third grade, with the third grade unit, and this book is not written in order from the beginning of her life to the end of her life. So the students actually had a really difficult time. They definitely had to go back to the text to be able to sort this out, to say, okay, What is the first thing that happened in her life, and what is the last thing we know of that happened in her life? They put those on the timeline and had to go back into the text and then sort out which are the important ideas and in what order did they happen. This really enabled them to do right, and they actually wrote a multiple paragraph essay about this. So when we're thinking about planning out a comprehensive ELD program, planning and being flexible is what makes it possible. We have to consider the levels of our English learners, and we have to read through the upcoming lesson or an upcoming lesson series and analyze the language demands, both receptive and expressive. So what are they going to have to read or watch or listen to, and what am I going to ask them to do with that? And we need to be able to know where we're headed with that so we can backwards map the instruction that they need that will take them into the content. So what language will they need ahead of reading the Amelia Earhart's Final Flight so that they can access it and then finally be able to produce the writing at the end or whatever their expressive task is. So we have to look for those places where scaffolds would be necessary to enable the students to access the content and express their understanding, and then plan the scaffolds into the upcoming lesson or lessons for designated ELD. Now, this flexibility is presuming that there's not a prescribed program that you have to use. And even if there is, these language lessons fit right into your ELA portion of your day or right alongside your integrated ELD that happens in any content area. Oftentimes, they might even pop up as you're reading. You might say, oh, I definitely need to focus on past tense when I come back to this tomorrow, because as we're reading this threw them off. So in that, you have the flexibility of what's my focus for tomorrow. So planning ahead makes it possible, but being flexible to adjust your plans within the day, within the lesson, and within a longer term, as well as what is going to be your focus for ELD, which is why, going back to the very beginning, key to this is really having some collaboration with your team. So if you're working with another teacher or a group of teachers, talking about all of this really helps. In addition to that, if you can divide up the demand on the teachers to say, I'm going to do an analysis of the language demands for science, and another person might take a look at social studies, and another person might take a look at ELA, etc. And so that kind of lightens the load for everybody, but provides the best scaffolds for all the students. An example of what this might look like, I came up with this one with a group of teachers when we were planning the unit, which was connected to third grade science. And they were reading about panda bears. They're reading many different things about pandas. But the language objective that we came up with for during ELD was that they would contribute to small group conversations describing the effects of climate change on polar bears, and they would use simple and more elaborated sentences with past tense verbs and coordinating conjunctions, because and so. So in that, what you'll see is, you'll see the mode. They're participating, contributing to a small group conversation. So this one is an oral language objective. And when you look at it, you can see the content. The content there is the climate change and polar bears. And the language, the grammar we're focused on is simple and more elaborated sentences using past tense verbs and coordinating conjunctions. So during this work, we had several different focuses. So a week-long language objective was broken up into several different lessons and opportunities for students to apply it. So we had a lesson on past tense, and then we identified the past tense words in the text. Then we had a lesson on coordinating conjunctions, when I taught the students their sentence frames, and they practice using those in different contexts. We also talked about simple sentences and what were the necessities in a simple sentence. And we also talked about how you could expand those and make them more elaborated. So how could you add details? And these were some of the ones that came up. This was a week-long plan, but actually turned more into about a 2.5-week plan because we added in a lot. So on a particular day, students may have been, their focus might have been to ask and answer questions about pandas. And that one may have actually been repeated. So we might have asked and answered questions about Panda on day 1 when we were finding out what students knew, their prior knowledge. And then we came back to those and we added to asking and answering questions about pandas almost every day. So that one was a recurring one. Listen actively to read alouds by asking and answering yes, no, and WH questions. And they viewed a video, described details about why pandas are endangered, retelling details from text using complete sentences and specific vocabulary, and then mixing it up so that they're working with partners. Students create a multi-flow map with the causes and the plight of panda. So that is a map that represents cause and effect. And the plight of the panda was one of the pieces of text that they read. They read text and identified keywords which indicated causes and effects, and they wrote a summary, and in their summary focused on past tense verbs and verb phrases, and they explained their flow maps to a partner, expressing those cause and effect relationships using coordinating conjunctions, because and so. And what's important about looking at this level of detail is that this is also how the teacher provides the students with feedback. So they're always learning this content, they're interacting with text, but today our focus is on asking and answering questions. So what am I going to give them feedback on, and what do I want them to put their cognitive energies toward? Asking and answering questions. So these little different things change throughout the course of the unit, but they build, so that they could actually, after this, they wrote paragraphs that described the effects of climate change on polar bears. So they were able to do that, which was their classroom in science class. That's what they were working on. They were actually writing paragraph that was explaining climate change, and it was about different animals, but in particular on polar bears. So this work orally and breaking it down into lots of little pieces really enabled them to get to that goal that was the goal for every student, English learner or not, in their classroom. And that is our webinar for tonight. And I would like to say thank you and ask if there are any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat today or to email us. And we'd actually like to ask you to share your ideas, topics you might be interested with, and questions you have. Share those with us, and be on the lookout for our upcoming summer webinar series. So we have some new topics coming up shortly, and we'll get you that information as soon as possible. Again, thank you. If there are any questions, I'll hang on for a minute, and otherwise, have a very nice evening.